The conference room is unnaturally cold at 11:58 p.m. on a Friday in late September. I sit across from 3 executives and their outside counsel, all looking exhausted after negotiations that should have ended hours ago. The termination agreements are spread across the polished table, each marked with tabs showing where signatures are required. I've reviewed every page 3 times, checking cross-references and verifying that every incorporation by reference is explicit. The Chief Strategy Officer loosens his tie and reaches for his pen. Let's just get this done. The SVP of Corporate Development nods, already signing without reading. Their attorney barely glances at the documents as he countersigns. They're treating this like a formality, an administrative nuisance before their weekend. I pick up my pen at exactly 11:58 p.m. and sign slowly, deliberately. No raised voices. No drama. Just ink on paper as binding agreements become enforceable. I set down my pen at 11:59 p.m. and watch the clock tick toward midnight. At exactly 12 a.m., my phone rings. Outside counsel, his voice tight with panic. Jonathan, the termination documents reference appendices. What appendices? We didn't receive any attachments. My stomach turns cold. I keep my voice steady. They were incorporated by reference in Section 7.3. They're binding as of execution. I wasn't always the person signing documents at midnight. 8 years ago, I joined Apex Global as Associate General Counsel, handling the complex contract work most attorneys found tedious. My background was regulatory compliance and corporate governance. Unglamorous but critical work ensuring agreements meant what people thought they meant. Over time, I developed a reputation for thoroughness. I'd find issues others missed, catch inconsistencies buried in footnotes, spot exposures that seemed minor until they weren't. When leadership needed sensitive situations handled, complex restructurings, executive separations requiring surgical precision, they called me. Not because I was senior, but because I was careful. I became the fixer. The person who handled things cleanly when details mattered more than speed, when one wrong word could trigger litigation. I didn't seek visibility. I just did the work correctly, documented everything, and protected the company from risks others didn't see. That's why they asked me to handle these terminations. They trusted me to get it right. The 3 executives being terminated weren't random casualties. They were powerful, deeply embedded in leadership, and connected in ways that made them seem untouchable. The Chief Strategy Officer had 19 years with the company. The SVP of Corporate Development had relationships with every major investor. The General Counsel had built the legal framework the company operated under. They walked into the meeting at 6 p.m. with casual confidence. They smiled, made small talk about weekend plans, treated the paperwork as an inconvenience. One joked about catching his early flight to Aspen. Another mentioned finalizing her consulting agreement. They were certain this was routine, that their status protected them, that this was just corporate theater before generous severance and quiet transitions. Their attorney mirrored their confidence. He'd negotiated dozens of executive separations. He knew the playbook. Sign the termination, negotiate severance, manage optics, move on. He treated this like any other executive exit, which made what happened next so devastating. Leadership had framed the terminations as strategic realignment, necessary evolution as the company prepared for growth. Internal communications emphasized fresh perspectives and renewed focus. The press release sat ready for Monday morning, talking about mutual agreements and appreciation for past service. But I'd seen the private emails. I'd been in closed-door meetings where real reasons were discussed in careful language designed to avoid discoverable admissions. This wasn't about strategy. It was about liability. Over 18 months, decisions these executives made were surfacing in ways that made the board nervous. Questions about disclosure timing. Questions about representations made to auditors. Questions about compliance with foreign regulations interpreted creatively at the time. The terminations were designed to create legal distance, ensuring that when regulators asked questions, the company could point to these executives as former employees whose decisions were made independently. The restructuring story was cover. The real purpose was creating a firewall. 3 weeks before the meeting, I'd noticed unusual urgency around timing. Leadership kept emphasizing everything needed to close before midnight on September 27th. Not end of month. Not end of quarter. Midnight on this specific Friday. The pressure felt disproportionate for a routine transition. I asked why the deadline mattered. Fiscal considerations, the General Counsel said vaguely. But that didn't explain the precision. I started digging through regulatory filings and governance documents. What I found was buried in the indemnification policy, a provision added 2 years ago during a governance review. Indemnification protections for executives in foreign jurisdictions expired at the fiscal period end unless explicitly renewed. The fiscal period ended at 11:59 p.m. on September 27th. After midnight, those protections dissolved. The terminations were timed to ensure the executives lost their protections exactly when exposure became real. When legal sent the final documents, the lead attorney was deliberately casual. Standard executive separation, she said. There are appendices covering indemnification and post-employment obligations, but you don't need to review them in detail. They're boilerplate. Just verify signature blocks and execution dates. That's when I decided to read every page. When someone tells you not to look closely, that's precisely when you should. I pulled up the complete set, 247 pages including appendices, and started reading. Not skimming. Reading. Every word, every cross-reference, every defined term. What I found wasn't boilerplate. It was surgical legal engineering designed to alter risk allocation in ways that wouldn't be obvious unless you read extremely carefully and understood how the pieces fit together. The appendices weren't optional additions. They were integral to the agreements, incorporated by reference in sections 3.4, 7.3, and 11.2. Appendix A redefined indemnification coverage, carving out protection for decisions made in foreign operations during specific periods. Appendix B outlined mandatory disclosure obligations that activated if regulatory inquiries were opened within 18 months. Appendix C established continuing accountability for representations made to the board. These weren't minor provisions. They fundamentally altered the liability landscape. Without the appendices, the agreements looked standard. With them, they stripped corporate protection and created personal exposure for specific past conduct. The appendices were effective immediately upon execution. Reading carefully, I realized they'd been crafted to seem routine while containing devastating implications for anyone who didn't read thoroughly. The language was technical but not obscure. Just dense enough that busy executives and confident attorneys might skim past it, especially late Friday when everyone wanted to finish. During my final review call, I asked one question: have the executives and their counsel specifically acknowledged the appendices? The silence told me everything. 4 seconds, an eternity on a business call. Then carefully, the documents reference the appendices. That's sufficient under contract law. Their counsel has the complete set. I pressed gently. But have they reviewed them? Do they understand what Appendix A does to indemnification? Another pause. That's their counsel's responsibility. We've provided all materials. We can't force them to read carefully. She was technically correct. We'd done everything required. The appendices were explicitly referenced. Complete documents had been transmitted. If they failed to read carefully, that was their problem. But I understood the game. Legal knew what the appendices contained. They also knew overconfident clients with expensive lawyers often don't read carefully. If the executives signed without understanding, that was intended, not accidental. The executives operated from perceived invulnerability. They'd spent years making high-level decisions. They were accustomed to dictating terms, having lawyers worry about details while they focused on strategy. Their status made them feel protected. They believed the company needed them more than they needed to understand what they were signing. Their attorney had been brought in late, given limited time to review complex documents, dealing with clients who treated legal review as irritating formality. I'd seen it before. Powerful executives who tell lawyers what to do instead of listening. They push for speed, dismiss concerns as excessive caution, assume risks are managed because they're paying someone expensive. The combination was predictable. Confident clients who didn't think they needed to read carefully. An attorney under time pressure, trusting his experience with standard separations. Everyone moving fast because finishing mattered more than understanding. Perfect setup for missing what was hidden in plain sight. I didn't warn them. I didn't call their counsel suggesting he read Appendices carefully. I didn't slow the process or raise alarms about explicitly referenced provisions. I just ensured every agreement was prepared exactly as drafted, every reference clear and unambiguous, every incorporation following proper form. The appendices were there, referenced explicitly in multiple sections. Anyone who read thoroughly would find them. The question was whether anyone would bother. Some might argue I had an ethical obligation to ensure they understood. But my obligation was to the company, not executives being terminated for cause. My job was ensuring documents accomplished their design, creating separation and shifting liability to withstand scrutiny. If they chose not to read what they signed, that wasn't my responsibility. At 11:58 p.m., after 7 hours of severance negotiations, documents were placed before me for final execution. I reviewed signature blocks, confirming every required party signed correctly. The executives signed between 11:43 and 11:51 p.m., signatures quick and careless. Their counsel countersigned at 11:54 p.m. Now my turn. As company signatory, my signature would complete execution and make all terms binding. I picked up my pen, fully aware of midnight significance. The appendices contained time-sensitive provisions tied to termination effective date. Once executed, certain protections expired at 12 a.m. Indemnification clauses shielding the executives would dissolve. Regulatory safe harbors would vanish. Deferred disclosure obligations would become immediate. I signed at 11:58 p.m. deliberately. Not rushed, not hesitant. Just thorough, the way I approached everything. I set down my pen and watched the wall clock. 2 minutes until everything changed irreversibly. My phone rang at 12 a.m. Hamilton Cruz's number. I answered on the second ring. The panic in his voice was barely controlled. "Jonathan, we just realized the termination documents reference appendices in section 7.3. "What appendices? We didn't receive any attachments." I kept my response factual. They were incorporated by reference in the executed agreements. They're binding as of execution at 11:58 p.m. tonight. Sharp intake of breath. Incorporated from where? We need to see these immediately. They were attached to the complete set transmitted to your office Tuesday, September 24th at 3:47 p.m. Subject line: Executive Termination Agreements. Final for review. The appendices were labeled and referenced in sections 3.4, 7.3, and 11.2. Silence. Then quieter. "We never saw them. Send them now." I forwarded the original transmission, sending the complete set. But the agreements are executed. The appendices became effective at 11:58 p.m. when I signed. I heard pages being pulled up, rapid scrolling. Cruz's breathing changed as he started reading. I heard him curse softly. Professional composure cracking, replaced by dawning realization. These appendices gut the indemnification provisions. They create mandatory disclosure obligations. They expose my clients to personal liability for decisions made years ago. That's correct. Appendix A modifies indemnification for foreign operations. Appendix B establishes disclosure requirements if regulatory inquiries open. Appendix C addresses continuing accountability for board representations. All incorporated by reference in executed agreements. Why weren't these flagged during negotiations? Anger mixing with panic. I stayed calm. They were part of the agreements your clients signed. References were explicit. Section 7.3 specifically states the provisions are incorporated by reference with the same force as if fully set forth. That language appeared on page 47. Longer silence. I could hear him trying to figure out how this happened, whose fault, whether it could be undone. Finally, walk me through the specific consequences. I walked him through it methodically. Appendix A eliminated indemnification for decisions about foreign operations between January 2021 and August 2024. This included compliance with foreign anti-bribery laws, disclosure timing for foreign revenue, representations to foreign regulators. Prior to tonight, the executives were covered by corporate indemnification. As of midnight, personally exposed. Appendix B created mandatory disclosure obligations if regulatory inquiries opened within 18 months. If the SEC, DOJ, or foreign regulators asked questions about operations during the executive's tenure, the company must provide complete documentation and notify regulators the executives were no longer covered. The executives would be on their own, personally defending decisions made in corporate capacities. Appendix C established continuing accountability for board representations. If those proved inaccurate or misleading, the executives could be held personally liable regardless of good faith. The appendix stated corporate indemnification didn't cover board misrepresentations, even unintentional ones. Cruz listened without interrupting. How damaging could this be? What's realistic exposure? I chose words carefully. That depends on what regulators find. But given decisions your clients made regarding foreign operations during the relevant period, exposure could be substantial, both financially and reputationally. The midnight deadline wasn't arbitrary. It was tied to specific contractual and regulatory timelines. The company's indemnification agreements with executives expired at fiscal period ends unless renewed. Due to an unusual provision added during governance review 2 years ago, the fiscal period for indemnification ended at 11:59 p.m. September 27th. Before midnight, executives operated under indemnification protecting them personally from liability for corporate decisions. After midnight, those protections dissolved unless new agreements were in place. The termination agreements were designed not to renew protections. Instead, through appendices, they carved out decision categories for which executives would have no corporate protection. The timing was surgical. Agreements executed at 11:58 p.m., binding immediately. At 12 a.m., old indemnification expired. At 12:01 a.m., executives were personally exposed for decisions made years ago, with no corporate shield and no way back. Cruz asked whether documents could be amended, signatures retracted, any mechanism to reverse what happened. I told him the truth calmly. The agreements specify they become irrevocable upon full execution. That occurred at 11:58 p.m. No amendments are permitted after execution without mutual written consent of all parties, including the company. The window closed at midnight. Who approved this structure? Cruz's voice shifted to controlled anger. Someone designed this deliberately. Who? I kept my response measured. Termination terms were authorized by the board's Compensation Committee September 18th. The legal framework was developed by our legal department with outside counsel. Final agreements were reviewed and approved at multiple levels. The structure was created through appropriate governance processes. But the appendices specifically, who wrote them? Who decided to bury these provisions? I paused, choosing accuracy over defensiveness. The appendices weren't buried. They were incorporated by reference in 3 separate sections. The language stating they were binding was on page 47, standard contract font, no unusual formatting. They were in the complete set transmitted 3 days before execution. If they weren't reviewed, that was a decision on your end, not deception on ours. The call continued 8 more minutes. Cruz tried various angles, arguing incorporation was unclear, suggesting late execution created duress, claiming appendices were so material they needed separate acknowledgement. Each argument fell apart. The incorporation language was textbook standard. Execution timing was agreed by all parties. Material provisions are routinely in appendices. Finally, was this designed to trap my clients? I answered honestly. It was designed to create enforceable separation agreements that shifted liability appropriately. Your clients had full access to all documents, adequate time to review, and competent counsel. If they signed without reading carefully, that reflects their judgment, not our deception. By 9 a.m. Monday, emergency meetings were convened. The acting general counsel, CFO, CEO, and 3 board members gathered. I was called in at 9:47 a.m. to explain what happened. Questions came rapid fire. How did appendices get included? Who knew about implications? Why wasn't anyone warned? I walked through the timeline methodically. Appendices were drafted by legal based on the board's directive to create clean separation from liability. They were reviewed by outside counsel. They were incorporated using standard legal language. They were transmitted to the Executive's Counsel 3 days before signing with clear subject line identification. Every step followed proper process. Someone suggested I'd misled the executives deliberately. I responded calmly. The appendices were incorporated by reference in sections 3.4, 7.3, and 11.2. The incorporation language was explicit and followed standard contract drafting. The complete set was transmitted September 24th at 3:47 p.m. Email subject was Executive Termination Agreements, final for review. Every reference was clear. The paper trail is complete. The acting general counsel pulled up email logs. The transmission records were there, time-stamped and detailed. The appendices had been sent as part of a PDF clearly labeled Termination Agreements with Appendices AC. Available for 73 hours before execution. No one asked questions. No one requested clarification. They'd simply been ignored. My name kept coming up in post-mortem discussions. Through back channels, I learned several people suggested I'd engineered the situation to trap executives, that I'd deliberately structured documents to mislead, that I'd withheld information I should have disclosed. The accusations were predictable but frustrating. I'd done exactly what I'd been asked. Create termination agreements that shifted liability cleanly while withstanding scrutiny. I'd followed proper procedures at every step. I'd ensured all documents were provided with adequate time. I hadn't hidden anything. I just relied on their assumption they didn't need to read carefully. When the acting general counsel asked directly whether I'd disclosed appendices appropriately, I provided detailed answer. The appendices were incorporated by reference using standard legal language any competent attorney would recognize. They were in the document set transmitted to opposing counsel with clear labeling. They were referenced in 3 separate sections. The incorporation language appeared on page 47 in standard formatting. If I'd highlighted them more explicitly, I would have undermined having them reviewed by counsel. It was their attorney's job to read and advise. I did my job. The question is whether he did his. The review concluded I'd acted appropriately and within authority. Documents were properly drafted and disclosed. No procedural errors. The executive's failure to understand what they signed was not the company's responsibility to prevent. The board ordered an independent review anyway. They brought in an outside firm specializing in legal malpractice and corporate governance to examine every aspect of the termination process. Reviewers spent 2 weeks going through documents, emails, communications. They interviewed everyone involved. Their report was thorough and unambiguous. The termination agreements were properly drafted using standard legal conventions. The appendices were incorporated by reference using clear, explicit language. Complete documents were provided to outside counsel with adequate time. There was no fraud, no misrepresentation, no procedural irregularity. The report specifically addressed whether appendices should have been highlighted more explicitly. The conclusion: incorporation by reference is standard legal practice. The language used was clear and followed conventional drafting standards. Opposing counsel had a professional obligation to review all referenced materials. The failure to do so reflects inadequacy of their review process, not deception by the company. The agreements were binding. The appendices were enforceable. The midnight deadline was legitimate. The executives had no legal recourse to challenge what they'd signed. Within a week, anticipated regulatory requests arrived. The SEC sent broad information requests related to foreign operations and revenue recognition practices between 2021 and 2024. The requests covered exactly what the appendices had flagged: compliance with foreign anti-bribery laws, timing of foreign revenue disclosures, accuracy of representations to auditors. The terminated executives scrambled to retain personal counsel, suddenly realizing they were on their own. Hamilton Crews had conflicts and couldn't represent them in regulatory matters. They needed lawyers specializing in defending individuals in government investigations. Those lawyers weren't cheap, and bills came out of their own pockets. The company responded by providing complete documentation, as Appendix B required. The response included formal notification that the 3 executives most involved in the relevant decisions had been terminated and were no longer covered by corporate indemnification for matters under investigation. The letter was professionally worded but devastating. It told regulators, these decisions were made by individuals no longer protected by the company. If you want accountability, go after them personally. The regulatory process would take months, possibly years. But the executives were on a path where they'd defend decisions made in corporate roles using personal resources, without legal and financial backing of the organization they'd served. 3 weeks after terminations, board member Catherine Drummond pulled me aside after a governance committee meeting. We were alone in the hallway. She didn't say anything official. She just looked at me and said quietly, "You did your job. You protected the company. That wasn't easy, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. The board appreciates that you executed this correctly." It wasn't an apology or formal thank you. Just quiet acknowledgement I'd done what needed to be done, even though it created uncomfortable questions and political complications. I nodded. I followed the procedures the board approved. The documents accomplished what they were designed to accomplish. She hesitated, then added, "Some people are going to remember this as the Appendices situation. They're going to wonder if you could have been more forthcoming. I want you to know the people who matter understand you did exactly what you were supposed to do." She walked away before I could respond. I stood there wondering if that acknowledgement was enough protection. If the investigation went badly, if the executives found some angle to create problems, would the board remember I'd followed their directives precisely? Or would they create distance between themselves and uncomfortable details? I didn't know. I documented everything and left no gaps. Through discreet conversations with former colleagues, I learned how the executives reacted after midnight. Before the call to their attorney, they'd been relaxed and confident. Andrew Brightwell joked during signing about getting through paperwork theater, so he could focus on his consulting practice. Patricia Thornton mentioned looking forward to controlling her schedule. After the call, after their attorney explained what the appendices meant, the mood shifted dramatically. Panic replaced confidence. They spent the weekend having emergency meetings with new lawyers, reviewing documents they should have read days earlier, trying to understand full exposure. Andrew's Aspen trip was cancelled. Patricia's consulting plans were put on hold while she found criminal defense attorneys. The executives had treated the termination process as routine bureaucracy, something to endure quickly rather than scrutinize. They'd been so confident in their status they hadn't bothered reading what they signed. They'd assumed their expensive attorney was managing details. After midnight, when full implications became clear, no one was laughing. No one was making weekend plans. They were just trying to figure out how badly they'd miscalculated. The disclosures mandated by Appendix B surfaced information over following months. As the SEC investigation progressed, the company provided documentation showing decision patterns that looked defensible when made but questionable in hindsight. Timing of foreign revenue recognition pushing income into favorable quarters. Interpretations of anti-bribery compliance that were aggressive but arguably supportable. Representations to auditors technically accurate but incomplete. None of it was clearly criminal, but all existed in gray areas requiring legal protection to navigate safely. Decisions corporate indemnification would have shielded became personally problematic once that protection was stripped. The executives had to defend judgment calls made years ago, explaining reasoning to investigators with hindsight and access to internal communications that looked worse out of context. The company emerged largely unscathed from regulatory review. When questioned about decisions under investigation, company counsel pointed to terminated executives as primary decision-makers. The separation worked exactly as intended, creating legal distance between current management and past decisions now under scrutiny. The firewall held. Careers ended quietly over the following year. Andrew Brightwell reached an SEC settlement including substantial financial penalties and a 5-year bar from serving as officer or director of any public company. No dramatic announcement, just a brief press release about resolving an investigation into foreign revenue recognition. Patricia Thornton avoided formal sanctions but found board nominations evaporated quietly. Her consulting practice never materialized. The third executive settled by accepting penalties and agreeing to cooperation terms that effectively ended his corporate leadership career. The settlements were individual, not corporate. The company paid nothing and admitted no wrongdoing. The separation created by termination agreements worked perfectly. Reputations collapsed without dramatic press coverage. Just quiet exits, withdrawn nominations, consulting practices that never materialized. The executives who'd walked into that conference room feeling invulnerable walked away from their careers within a year, destroyed not by public scandal but by slow accumulation of consequences for decisions they'd made and agreements they hadn't read. People asked me afterward how it happened. How 3 experienced executives and their sophisticated attorneys signed documents without understanding what they contained. I gave the same answer every time. They signed what they didn't bother to understand. I didn't trick anyone. I didn't hide anything. The appendices were there, incorporated by reference using language any competent contract attorney should recognize. They were included in the document set transmitted to opposing counsel with adequate time. Every reference was explicit. Every cross-reference was clear. They assumed their status protected them from needing to read carefully. They assumed their expensive attorney was managing details. They assumed the company needed them more than they needed to understand what they were agreeing to. Every assumption was wrong. And at midnight on September 27th, those wrong assumptions became permanent. I went home that night and slept soundly. Not because I'd won something, but because I'd done exactly what I was supposed to do. I'd protected the company by ensuring every document was executed properly, every term was enforceable, every reference was explicit. The executives had the same information I did. They just chose not to read it. And at midnight, that choice became permanent.